She saw me leaving the Ritz-Carlton, and suddenly my son became her golden ticket to a life of luxury. I am Loretta. I am 62 years old, and I prefer a good, warm thrift store sweater over any designer label. To my future daughter-in-law, Chloe, I was just a broke old woman who stood in the way of her perfect aesthetic. She never had a kind word for me, usually rolling her eyes whenever I walked into a room. That was until a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was stepping out of a private wealth management meeting at the Ritz, adjusting my old coat, when I locked eyes with her across the street. I watched the realization hit her face. The woman she thought was a penniless burden was actually walking out of the most exclusive financial suite in the city. Instantly, her usual cold glare melted into a terrifying, aggressive sweetness. She rushed over, calling me Mum for the very first time. I recognized that sudden shift immediately. The dollar signs were practically flashing in her eyes. She thought she had hit the jackpot. But I knew better. I learned a long time ago that invisible wealth gives you power. I always kept my success quiet because visible wealth attracts predators. Chloe thought she was reeling me in, but I decided right then to smile, play along, and set a trap to test her true intentions. I let her hug me. I let her pretend she suddenly cared about my health and my day. I played the part of the lonely, confused older woman thrilled to finally get some attention from her future daughter-in-law. She thought she was the one pulling the strings, playing a brilliant game of manipulation, but she severely underestimated who she was dealing with. I raised my son Jamal all by myself after my husband passed. I worked grueling 16-hour shifts, building a catering business from the ground up, just so Jamal could have a good life. He grew up to be a kind middle school teacher with a pure heart. I would give my last breath to protect him. I was not about to let an opportunistic gold digger use my boy as a pawn to drain the legacy I broke my back to build. Chloe honestly believed I was just a naive old lady she could easily step over and discard once she got her hands on my bank accounts. She was already planning her lavish future on my dime. But I had a surprise waiting for her. I had a flawlessly drafted legal document, a trap disguised as a wedding gift. I was fully prepared to pay for the extravagant wedding she always dreamed of and let her believe she had won the ultimate prize. I was going to let her sign a paper she was too greedy to read, turning her own ambition into her spectacular downfall. My husband passed away when Jamal was just a little boy. I was left alone with a mountain of bills and a heart full of heavy grief. But I had a son to raise. I wiped my tears, rolled up my sleeves, and got to work. I started a small catering business out of my cramped, poorly lit kitchen. Those early days were a relentless blur of flour sweat and sheer willpower. I worked grueling 16-hour shifts, baking, cooking, and delivering food until my feet throbbed and my hands were calloused beyond recognition. Slowly but surely, through decades of unbreakable determination, that little kitchen operation grew into a massive commercial catering empire. We secured highly sought-after contracts with luxury hotels, corporate offices, and grand event halls across the entire city. By the time Jamal was finishing college, a major corporation bought me out for millions of dollars. It was enough money to ensure I would never have to lift a finger again. But I made a very conscious and firm decision that day. I kept the massive windfall a complete secret. I put the money into quiet trusts and secure investments and continued living in the exact same modest 3-bedroom house we had always called home. I drove the same reliable old car and shopped at the same local grocery stores. I wanted my son to deeply understand the value of a hard-earned dollar. I wanted him to build his own strong character, free from the corrupting shadow of unearned wealth. And it worked beautifully. Jamal grew up to be an incredibly grounded, hard-working man. He chose a career driven by pure passion, not profit, becoming a dedicated middle school teacher. He poured his whole heart into helping children, and I was so deeply proud of the man he had become. But his exceptionally kind nature also made him vulnerable. He always saw the absolute best in people, even when they gave him every reason not to. Then Chloe walked into his life, and everything shifted. From the very first dinner they shared at my house, I felt a cold, unsettling chill in my bones. Chloe was wrapped in expensive fabrics and dripping with loud entitlement. She sat at my worn wooden dining table, looking around my humble home with thinly veiled disgust. She pushed her food around her plate, making subtle, biting remarks about how quaint and outdated my neighborhood was. Jamal, completely blinded by what he thought was true love, just smiled, oblivious to the sharp, cruel edges of her words. As their relationship progressed, her true greedy nature became impossible to ignore. She was obsessively materialistic. Every single conversation somehow circled back to money status and what other people possessed. She constantly complained about Jamal taking a modest teacher salary. I would hear her nagging him endlessly about how his friends were buying luxury cars and vacationing in Europe while they were budgeting for basic groceries. She made him feel incredibly small for choosing a noble profession over a highly lucrative one. Whenever she visited, she would glance at my thrift store sweaters and practical shoes with sheer, unapologetic contempt. She treated me not like a future mother-in-law, but like a tragic charity case she had to endure for the sake of appearances. She would brag loudly about designer brands and high society events, waiting for me to look impressed or intimidated. I never once took the bait. I simply smiled, offered her another slice of sweet potato pie, and let her believe whatever she wanted to believe about my life. I knew the truth about my heavy bank accounts, so her shallow judgments meant absolutely nothing to me. But it broke my heart to see my son bending over backward, picking up extra tutoring shifts late into the night, just to buy her the overpriced handbags she demanded. He was exhausting himself to keep up with a lifestyle she felt entitled to, and she never once showed an ounce of genuine gratitude. The situation grew infinitely worse when I met her family, particularly her older brother Brad. Brad was a wealthy, arrogant, white American man who carried himself like the entire world owed him a massive favor. He was constantly pitching aggressive, risky business ideas and looking down his nose at anyone who did not match his supposed tax bracket. The first time he stepped into my home for a family holiday gathering, he did not even bother to wipe his expensive shoes on the front mat. He strolled through my living room, scoffing openly at my vintage floral couch and the handmade quilts I had carefully draped over the chairs. He actually chuckled and asked Jamal if we were planning to open a museum of poverty. The sheer, unadulterated disrespect was staggering. But Brad did far more than just insult my home. He actively and maliciously preyed on my son. I would overhear Brad cornering Jamal in the kitchen, pressuring him heavily to take out massive personal loans to fund Chloe's extravagant tastes. He would tell Jamal that if he wanted to keep a high-maintenance woman like Chloe, he needed to step up and act like a real provider, urging him to finance luxury trips and high-end jewelry on credit. Brad treated Jamal like a financial stepping stone, a gullible fool they could mold into their personal credit line. Every maternal instinct in my body screamed at me to kick Brad out of my house and banish them both from my son's life forever. But I bit my tongue and swallowed my righteous anger. I endured their sneers, their condescending financial advice, and their blatant disrespect in complete silence. I did it because I saw the way Jamal looked at Chloe. He loved her deeply, and I prioritized his temporary peace over my own pride. I desperately wanted to believe that my son would eventually see through their shallow, greedy facade on his own. I never imagined that enduring their constant insults would eventually set the stage for the most spectacular reckoning of their lives. It was a chilly Tuesday afternoon when the facade finally cracked. I had just finished my quarterly review with my wealth management attorney Reginald Barnes at the Ritz-Carlton downtown. We had been discussing the reallocation of a few $1 million in my private trust fund. I stepped out through those heavy glass doors, buttoning up my favorite thrift store cardigan to block the cold wind. The valet was just pulling up Reginald's town car when I felt a pair of eyes burning into the side of my head. I turned, and there she was, Chloe. She was standing across the street outside a high-end boutique, holding a shopping bag she probably could not afford. She watched intently as Reginald, a man dressed in a pristine, custom-tailored suit, shook my hand with his utmost respect and handed me a thick, leather-bound portfolio. I saw her jaw practically hit the pavement. The older woman she always thought was a penniless charity case was receiving VIP treatment at the most exclusive luxury hotel in the city. Our eyes met across the busy traffic. I gave her a polite, knowing nod and stepped into my reliable 10-year-old sedan. By the time I parked in my driveway 40 minutes later, my cell phone was already ringing. It was Chloe. Her voice sounded breathless, high-pitched, and dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my stomach churn. She asked if she could drop by right away to see her favorite person in the world. Less than an hour later, she was standing on my front porch. For 2 whole years, she had barely managed to call me Miss Loretta, usually just avoiding addressing me altogether. Now she barged right into my small living room, threw her arms around my neck and squealed that she missed her mum so much today. The sheer audacity of the word mum leaving her lips was almost laughable. She thrust a velvet jewelry box into my hands. Inside was a flashy gold-plated necklace. She claimed it was an exclusive designer piece she just had to buy for me because it perfectly matched my beautiful eyes. I knew instantly it was a cheap knockoff from a discount rack, the kind that turns your skin green after one wear. But I smiled warmly, played the part of the grateful elder, and told her it was simply too generous. Suddenly, she could not get enough of my company. She plopped down on my vintage floral couch. The exact same couch her brother Brad had viciously mocked and insisted we needed to start having weekly family dinners. She talked endlessly about how much she valued our bond and how she and Jamal wanted to include me in every single detail of their future plans. I sat there sipping my hot tea, nodding along to her transparent lies. Chloe honestly thought she was reeling in a clueless old lady with a fat bank account. She had no idea she had just walked right into my trap. The very next weekend, Chloe and her brother Brad invited themselves over for Sunday dinner. I knew exactly what this visit was about. They walked into my home with a predatory energy, their eyes scanning the walls and the furniture as if they were already slapping price tags on my life. Brad did not even wait for the food to be served before he started laying the groundwork. He tapped his expensive leather shoe against my hardwood floor and sighed heavily, mentioning how drafty and terribly outdated my house felt. Chloe immediately chimed in, placing her hand over mine with that chilling artificial sweetness she had just recently perfected. She looked at me with wide, fake, sympathetic eyes and said they had been deeply worried about my future. She pulled a stack of glossy brochures out of her designer handbag and spread them across my dining table. They were pamphlets for a budget retirement facility on the edge of town. Chloe insisted that a woman of my age had absolutely no business maintaining such a large, empty property all by herself. She claimed I would be much safer and far less lonely, surrounded by people my own age with nurses available around the clock. Brad took over the pitch, leaning forward like a corporate shark closing a hostile takeover. He smoothly suggested that they could handle the burden of selling my house so I would not have to stress over the complicated paperwork. They offered to manage my finances entirely, putting the proceeds of the house sale into a joint account where they could comfortably monitor my expenses and ensure I was taken care of. It was a beautifully orchestrated performance. They were wrapping their blatant greed in a thick layer of fake family devotion. Then came the true reason for their visit. Chloe lowered her voice, acting as if she were sharing a painful burden. She sighed and said that wedding costs were spiraling completely out of control. She claimed her dream wedding was going to cost at least $100,000 a figure. She dropped casually as if she were asking for a few dollars for groceries. Brad quickly added that since they were going to manage my assets and secure my living situation, it made perfect financial sense for me to advance them the wedding funds from the house sale. In their minds, my money was already their money. They were simply accelerating the inheritance process while I was still breathing. A younger, more impulsive version of myself would have grabbed them both by their collars and thrown them out onto the street. But I remembered that invisible wealth requires incredible discipline. I looked at the brochures, let my hands tremble just a fraction, and furrowed my brow. I played the part of the overwhelmed, compliant older woman flawlessly. I murmured that the numbers were just too confusing for me to understand, and asked if they really thought this retirement home was the safest option. Chloe beamed with a victorious, predatory smile, assuring me that they would handle absolutely everything. I nodded slowly, promising to think it over, giving them the exact illusion of control they so desperately craved. They left my house that evening entirely convinced that they had successfully manipulated a helpless widow into handing over her entire life savings. They had no idea I was quietly watching them dig a hole they would never be able to climb out of. A few days after that infuriating Sunday dinner, I decided to spend a quiet afternoon organizing my bedroom upstairs. I had told Chloe and Jamal that I was feeling a bit under the weather and was going to take a long nap. Jamal had to go back to school to grade exams, but Chloe insisted she and Brad would stay downstairs to keep an eye on the house and make sure I was not disturbed. I was sitting on the edge of my bed when my cell phone buzzed with a motion detection alert. A few months prior, I had installed a discreet, high-definition smart home security system. I put a small camera on the bookshelf in the living room just to keep an eye on the front door. I rarely ever checked the live feed, but the notification caught my attention. I tapped the application, and the crystal-clear video loaded. My blood ran completely cold. There was Chloe, lounging on my vintage floral couch, with her feet propped up on my mahogany coffee table. Beside her sat Brad, looking perfectly at home in the space he loved to insult. What truly made my stomach churn was the sight of my prized bottle of imported red wine sitting open between them. It was a vintage bottle I had saved from a trip to Italy. Chloe was holding one of my crystal glasses, swirling the dark liquid carelessly, while Brad chugged his like it was cheap soda. I turned up the volume on my phone, bringing the speaker close to my ear. The audio was flawless, picking up every single word echoing through my living room. Chloe laughed a sharp, mocking sound that completely lacked the fake sweetness she used with me. She told Brad that my old house smelled like mothballs and failure, but it was going to pay out beautifully in the end. She took a sip of my wine, telling him I was so desperate for a daughter-in-law that I would sign away my soul just for a little company. I sat frozen on my bed. Every maternal instinct screamed at me to march down those stairs and throw them both out onto the pavement. But I forced myself to stay absolutely still. I pressed the record button on the security application, capturing every frame of video and every syllable of their malicious plotting. I knew I needed to let them keep talking. Brad leaned back with a smug grin. He praised Chloe for her performance, calling her an absolute genius. He told her that as soon as the wedding was over and the rings were exchanged, they would put the next phase of the plan into motion. He said Jamal was too soft and too distracted by his teaching job to notice what was happening right under his nose. Brad explicitly stated that they would convince Jamal I was losing my mind slowly but surely until they had enough leverage to step in and take total control. Chloe nodded enthusiastically, pouring herself another generous glass of my expensive vintage wine. She told her brother that once they had legal authority over my assets, they would liquidate this depressing house, throw me into the cheapest facility they could find, and use the rest of the funds to cover the wedding debts and invest in his new startup. Listening to them dissect my life, My sanity and my son's future with such casual cruelty felt like a physical blow to the chest. They were not just greedy, they were entirely ruthless. They viewed my hard-working son as a naive stepping stone, and they viewed me as a disposable asset. I watched my phone screen as they clinked their glasses together in a toast to their deception. They thought they had outsmarted a foolish widow. They had no idea they were raising a glass to their own destruction. I stopped the recording, safely securing the file. The pain of their betrayal was sharp, but it quickly dissolved into a pure, calculated focus. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone gripped tightly, replaying the audio file to make sure I was not having a nightmare. The high-definition speaker delivered Chloe's sharp voice into the quiet of my bedroom. She was laughing, a cruel and hollow sound echoing off my walls. I listened as she mocked my beautiful boy. She called Jamal a pathetic soft touch, bragging to her brother about how easy it was to manipulate him. She said, Jamal was so desperate for affection that he would agree to anything she suggested. She bragged about conditioning him to feel guilty whenever he tried to establish a boundary, twisting his naturally giving nature into a weapon used to extract expensive gifts and lavish dinners. Listening to her describe my son as if he were nothing more than a gullible mark in a cheap con game made my chest ache. Jamal had given her his entire heart, and she was stepping all over it with muddy shoes. Then Brad's voice took over the recording, steering the conversation toward their actual objective. His tone was brisk and entirely void of human empathy. He told Chloe the wedding was merely the finish line for Phase 1. Once the vows were exchanged and Jamal was legally tied down, they would launch the real operation. Brad outlined a terrifying plan to forge legal documents declaring me mentally incompetent. He boasted about knowing a shady lawyer who specialized in exploiting the elderly. He told Chloe they would wait a few weeks after the honeymoon wait, until Jamal was swamped with grading midterms and then strike. They planned to slip fake medical evaluations into my records, claiming I was suffering from severe cognitive decline and delusions. Brad said they would easily convince Jamal that I was a danger to myself and needed to be institutionalized. By the time my son figured out what was happening, Brad proudly stated they would already possess total legal authority over my life, home, and bank accounts. The scale of their greed became blindingly clear as the recording continued. Brad confidently calculated how they would liquidate my assets the second the ink dried on the guardianship papers. He admitted, laughing openly, that his latest tech startup was on the verge of bankruptcy and he was drowning in desperate debt. He declared my hidden millions would be the perfect, unmonitored slush fund to rescue his failing business. Chloe chimed in with her own greedy demands, completely indifferent to her brother's financial ruin as long as she got her cut. She eagerly listed the luxury cars, massive European vacations, and sprawling beachfront estate she planned to purchase, using the money I had literally broken my back to earn. They spoke about draining my accounts. Dry, casually dividing the wealth of a woman who was still very much alive, and listening to their every word. They did not view me as a human being or a mother. To them, I was just an overgrown piggy bank standing between them and a lifetime of unearned extravagance. I paused the recording, letting the heavy silence wash over me. For a fleeting moment, a profound wave of heartbreak washed through my soul. I wept silent tears for my son, grieving the devastating pain he was going to feel when he finally learned the truth about the woman he wanted to marry. I wept for the beautiful future he thought he was building, a future that was nothing but a mirage, engineered by a pair of soulless grifters. But those hot tears dried very quickly. The deep sorrow evaporated, replaced by a freezing, calculated rage. This was no longer just a case of my son dating a toxic woman. This was a malicious financial scam designed to destroy my family and steal my legacy. Chloe and Brad truly believed they were the smartest people in the room, treating my son like a disposable pawn and me like a senile fool. They thought they had backed me into a corner, but they were dealing with a woman who built an empire from scratch. I wiped my face and locked my phone. I was going to crush them. I did not shed a tear that dark night. Crying is for those who have lost hope, and I was far from hopeless. I was furious. The next morning, before the sun even fully illuminated the neighborhood, I was already dressed in my sharpest suit, the one I used to wear when negotiating multi-million-dollar catering contracts. I drove straight downtown to the glass skyscraper that housed my wealth management, attorney Reginald Barnes. Reginald and I went way back. He had been by my side when I sold my catering empire, and he knew exactly how hard I had fought for every single penny of my fortune. I walked right past his receptionist and went straight into his quiet private office. I did not even offer a greeting. I just sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his massive oak desk, pulled out my smartphone, and hit play. I watched his usually calm and perfectly collected face harden into a mask of pure professional outrage as he listened to Chloe and Brad map out their sinister plot to ruin my life and drain my accounts. When the digital audio file finished playing, a heavy silence fell over the room. Reginald slowly took off his reading glasses, rubbed his temples, and looked at me with a fierce determination. He asked me exactly how I wanted to permanently handle these two vicious predators. I told him I did not just want to protect my hard-earned money. I simply wanted to teach them a painful lesson they would never forget. We spent the next 5 very intense hours locked in that office, meticulously dismantling every single avenue they could possibly use to harm me. First, we moved my entire financial portfolio, all my liquid assets, properties, and trusts into a completely impenetrable blind trust structure. We made absolutely sure that no one, not even a corrupt judge, operating under false pretenses, could ever grant them access to a single dime of my wealth. We firmly locked down my medical directives, appointing Reginald himself as my sole healthcare proxy, effectively blocking any attempt they might make to forcibly institutionalize me or falsely declare me mentally unfit. But securing my assets was only the first half of our defensive strategy. The second half was crafting the perfect trap. Reginald smiled a razor-thin, calculated smile as we drafted a very specific legal document. It was a strict binding contract disguised as a generous wedding gift agreement. The paperwork explicitly stated that I would happily cover the entire $100,000 cost of Chloe and her dream wedding. But it contained a devastating stipulation buried deep within the complex legal jargon. If any attempt was ever made to defraud, manipulate, or financially exploit the benefactor, the entire cost of the wedding would immediately become a high interest personal loan payable in full by the bride and her brother. Furthermore, signing the document meant they unknowingly waived all rights to any future inheritance or any possible financial support. We printed the final contract on thick, expensive paper. It looked just like a golden ticket, a generous blessing from a compliant, wealthy mother-in-law. In harsh reality, it was a ruthless financial guillotine. I walked out of his office that afternoon, feeling an immense sense of power and absolute mental clarity. Chloe and Brad thought they were master manipulators playing a brilliant game against a foolish, senile old woman. They had no idea they had just provoked a veteran business shark who was about to turn their relentless greed into their ultimate downfall. With the legal trap securely in place, it was time to let Chloe and Brad dig their own graves. I called them back to my house 2 days later and put on the performance of a lifetime. I deliberately forced my hands to shake slightly as I held my teacup, looking down at the floor like a defeated, tired old woman who had finally surrendered. I told them that after much thought I agreed with their assessment of my future. I said I wanted Chloe to have the extravagant wedding she had always dreamed of, and I was willing to fund the entire $100,000 budget. The sheer greed that flashed across their faces was utterly sickening. Chloe actually squealed and hugged me, shedding a few forced tears while Brad gave me a smug, patronizing pat on the shoulder, telling me I was finally making a smart investment. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. They immediately dove into planning the most lavish, overpriced event this city had ever seen. They booked a grand ballroom at an exclusive country club, ordered thousands of dollars in imported floral arrangements, and hired a gourmet catering team that charged outrageous premiums. Every single vendor required a massive deposit and a signed contract. That is where my brilliant attorney Reginald worked his magic. I did not sign a single document in my own name. Instead, Reginald established a highly specialized limited liability company specifically to process the wedding expenses. When it came time to finalize the paperwork, I presented Chloe and Brad with a stack of thick legal contracts. I played the part of the confused, compliant mother-in-law. Perfectly, I told them that my financial advisor insisted the funds be managed through this corporate entity for tax purposes. I pointed to the signature lines and casually mentioned that the vendors just needed them to sign as the primary beneficiaries of the event to release the funds. Blinded entirely by their own towering ambition and staggering greed, neither of them bothered to read the fine print. They were far too busy imagining their luxurious future to notice the razor-sharp behavioral clauses buried deep within those pages. The contracts explicitly stated that the LLC would cover the event costs only under the strict condition that the beneficiaries did not engage in any fraudulent, manipulative, or financially abusive behavior toward the primary funder. If those terms were breached, the funding would be immediately revoked, and Chloe and Brad would automatically become fully liable as the primary guarantors for every single penny of the staggering $100,000 debt. They signed their names with enthusiastic flourishes, effectively locking the heavy iron gates of their own financial prison. The next 3 months were an excruciating test of my patience. I accompanied Chloe to endless cake tastings, dress fittings, and venue walkthroughs. I sat quietly in the corner of upscale boutiques while she paraded around in custom gowns, treating the retail staff like absolute garbage. Brad was always hovering nearby, acting like the master architect of this grand illusion. He would lean against the pierced wall, swirling a glass of champagne, and make smug, insulting remarks right to my face. He laughed and told the bridal consultants that the old lady had finally decided to open her dusty purse and join the 21st century. He joked that it was a miracle I had any money left after spending my whole life baking pies in a cramped, greasy kitchen. Every single cruel insult, every condescending smirk, and every theatrical eye roll was a bitter pill to swallow. I deeply wanted to scream at them to expose their vile intentions right there in the crowded bridal shop. But I simply adjusted my worn thrift store sweater, offered a polite vacant smile, and calmly nodded along. I silently endured their relentless disrespect because I knew something they did not. They were blindly planning a magnificent celebration on a mountain of high-interest debt. Dancing on a stage I fully controlled. I watched them eagerly prepare for their spectacular downfall, knowing the exact moment I would pull the rug completely out from under their 2 feet. Just 3 days before the extravagant wedding was set to take place, I invited Chloe and her brother Brad to my home for one final meeting. I brewed a fresh pot of chamomile tea and arranged a plate of homemade butter cookies, perfectly setting the stage for my performance. When they walked through my front door, they were practically buzzing with arrogant energy. They believed they were in the final stretch of their grand con. I guided them to my worn dining table, asking them to sit down, because I had a very special surprise to share. I let my voice waver just a fraction, playing the role of the sentimental, slightly overwhelmed older woman wanting to bless her new family. I reached into my canvas tote bag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder containing the trap Reginald and I had so carefully designed. I slid the document across the table toward Chloe. I told her that I had been doing a lot of thinking about her future with my son, Jamal. I explained that I wanted to give them a pre-wedding financial gift, a massive trust fund, that would guarantee they never had to worry about money again. I casually mentioned that my accountant had thrown together some standard paperwork just to make sure the tax implications were handled properly. I watched Chloe's eyes widen as she opened the folder. The first page clearly displayed a staggering sum of money, a series of zeros that practically glowed in the dim light of my modest kitchen. Her breath hitched. The sheer magnitude of the wealth laid out before her was intoxicating. She immediately looked over at her brother, her eyes flashing with triumphant, unadulterated greed. Brad smoothly took the folder from her hands, clearing his throat and adjusting his designer jacket. He tried to act like a seasoned financial advisor, puffing out his chest to inspect the paperwork on his sister's behalf. He flipped through the thick stack of pages with reckless speed. He was not looking for behavioral clauses, liability triggers, or the hidden stipulations Reginald had meticulously buried in the dense legal jargon. Brad was only looking at the payout schedules and the massive figures listed in the summary. His monumental arrogance made him sloppy. He honestly believed I was far too simple-minded to comprehend complex legal structures, let alone weaponize them. He thought he was looking at a standard wealth transfer from a naive widow. He gave Chloe a smug, knowing nod, handing her a silver pen and telling her it was an absolute goldmine. Without a single second of hesitation, Chloe eagerly snatched the pen. She did not ask to take the document home to read it over carefully. She did not request to have an independent lawyer review the terms. Driven entirely by her blinding ambition and desperate hunger for luxury, she scribbled her signature across the bottom of the final page. She handed the heavy folder back to me with a brilliant predatory smile, calling me the absolute best mother in the entire world. She honestly thought she had just secured her wildly extravagant future and legally locked down my entire fortune. I smiled back at her, carefully placing the signed legal contract into my bag. My heart beat with a cold, rhythmic satisfaction. The blue ink was dry. The Trojan horse had been pulled securely inside their gates. They had just signed away their leverage, their financial security, and their entire future, completely oblivious to the spectacular ruin waiting for them on the other side of the altar. What Chloe and her arrogant brother failed to realize in their greedy haste to secure my wealth was that they had just signed their own financial death warrants. They thought that leather-bound folder was their golden ticket to endless luxury and early inheritance. But my brilliant attorney Reginald and I had drafted a masterpiece of legal retribution. I needed to share the true nature of that document with you because it was the ultimate trap. It was not a generous pre-wedding financial gift or a trust fund set up for their extravagant future. It was an ironclad, legally binding contract, acknowledging that the entire $100,000 budget I provided for her lavish wedding was a direct high-interest loan given specifically to Chloe, and backed by Brad as her primary guarantor. They had eagerly signed a document that made them personally liable for every single expensive flower arrangement, every drop of imported champagne, and every hour of that overpriced venue. But Reginald and I did not stop there. The true genius of the contract lay hidden within the behavioral clauses they were too arrogant to read. The document explicitly stated that this massive loan would become payable immediately in full upon any documented proof of financial fraud, elder abuse, or infidelity. Furthermore, by signing on the dotted line, Chloe unknowingly agreed to a comprehensive prenuptial waiver. She completely surrendered any and all rights to Jamal's future inheritance or any alimony claims against my estate, should the marriage dissolve under fraudulent circumstances. She thought she was securing her place in my will, but she had actually legally severed herself from my empire forever. My assets were completely shielded behind the impenetrable wall of my newly formed limited liability company. And Chloe was left holding a ticking financial time bomb. For the next few days, I played my part flawlessly. I watched Chloe parade around my home, boasting about her custom designer gown and the lavish honeymoon she thought I was financing. I smiled sweetly as Brad made his underhanded comments about my outdated furniture, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the legal power to bankrupt him in a matter of seconds. I let them enjoy their false victory, savoring the delicious irony of their situation. Every time Chloe swiped that corporate card to pay for another ridiculous wedding expense, she was simply digging her grave a few feet deeper. I sat back and observed their monstrous greed run wild, knowing that they were joyfully funding their own spectacular downfall with money they would soon owe me directly. The tension reached its absolute peak on the morning of the wedding. I woke up before dawn as the first rays of sunlight crept through my bedroom window. The house was completely silent, but a storm was brewing. I stood in front of my mirror, smoothing out the pristine fabric of my elegant silver dress. I looked at the reflection of a woman who had survived the loss of a husband, built a thriving business from nothing, and fiercely protected her only son. I reached into my safe and pulled out the manila envelope containing the security footage transcript, the audio recordings, and the executed loan contracts. Today was the day Jamal would finally see the truth. Today was the day Chloe would walk down the aisle expecting a crown, only to be handed a pair of handcuffs. I took a deep, steadying breath and smiled. The trap was perfectly set, and it was time to snap it shut. The evening of the rehearsal dinner arrived wrapped in a suffocating layer of pretension. Chloe had chosen a venue that looked like a royal palace, dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing with imported white orchids. Her side of the family and all her high society friends filled the room, clinking expensive champagne glasses and laughing too loudly. I sat quietly next to my son Jamal, wearing my emerald green silk dress, sipping sparkling water and waiting for the perfect moment. The atmosphere was thick with fake smiles and whispered judgments about Jamal and me, but I kept my composure. After the main course was cleared away, Brad stood up and tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The room fell silent as he took the microphone, smoothing his custom-tailored suit. He looked directly at me with that familiar, sickening smirk. He raised his glass and made a toast, thanking me for finally opening my dusty old wallet to fund a wedding that his sister truly deserved. He joked to the crowd that it took a lot of convincing to get a stubborn old baker to understand modern luxury, but they had finally taught me how to spend my money. The crowd chuckled politely, and Jamal looked down, visibly uncomfortable with the blatant disrespect. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress, and signaled to the audiovisual technician I had privately hired for the evening. I walked to the front of the room, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, and took the microphone from Brad. I looked out at the sea of expectant faces and told them that since Brad was so eager to talk about my money, I thought it was only fair to share exactly how this beautiful wedding came to be. I pressed a button on the small remote in my hand, and the massive projection screens surrounding the ballroom flickered to life. Instead of the romantic photo montage Chloe had planned, the crystal-clear security footage from my living room filled the giant screens. Chloe and Brad's voices boomed through, the state-of-the-art sound system echoing off the high ceilings. The entire ballroom heard Chloe laugh sharply, calling my house a smelly dump and bragging about how easy it was to manipulate my soft and pathetic son. They heard Brad lay out his detailed, calculated plan to declare me mentally incompetent, institutionalize me, and drain my bank accounts to fund his failing startup and Chloe's luxury lifestyle. The colour instantly drained from Chloe's face as she watched herself on the giant screen, carelessly swirling my expensive vintage wine and plotting to throw me into a cheap facility. Brad stood frozen next to me. His smug smirk completely wiped away, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. The horrified gasps from the guests rippled through the room like a shockwave. I stood perfectly still, looking at the two of them with the cold, unyielding gaze of a mother who had just protected her cub. Total chaos erupted in the elegant ballroom the second the video stopped playing. Chloe's pretentious friends started murmuring in absolute disgust. Many of them immediately reaching for their purses to leave. I turned to look at Jamal. My beautiful, hard-working son was staring at the screens, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound heartbreak and shocking realization. The woman he loved. The woman he had given his entire heart and soul to had just been exposed as a ruthless, calculating monster. Chloe ran toward him, tears ruining her perfect makeup, grabbing his arm and desperately sobbing that it was all a terrible misunderstanding, that the video was a malicious fake. Jamal looked down at her hands, gently but firmly detached himself from her grip and stepped back. He looked her right in the eyes, his voice steady, but laced with deep sorrow, and told her he never wanted to see her face again. Without looking back, Jamal turned and walked toward the exit, his shoulders straight and his dignity intact. As Chloe wailed, my attorney Reginald Barnes stepped out from the shadows of the back room. He walked briskly to the center of the dance floor, wearing a sharp black suit and carrying a heavy leather briefcase. He approached the sobbing bride and her petrified brother, handing them each a thick stack of legal documents. Reginald announced, in a clear, booming professional voice, that due to the undeniable evidence of planned financial abuse and fraud, the behavioral clauses in the wedding funding contract had been officially triggered. He informed them that the limited liability company funding the event was immediately withdrawing all financial support, because Chloe and Brad had eagerly signed as the primary guarantors. Without reading the fine print, they were now legally bound to a $100,000 debt. Reginald clearly stated that the venue, the luxury catering, the imported flowers, the custom dress, and every single drop of champagne consumed that night were now entirely their financial responsibility, payable immediately. Brad aggressively grabbed the papers, his hands shaking violently as he read the highlighted clauses, realizing his towering arrogance had just sealed his absolute financial ruin. He stammered, demanding to speak to his own lawyer, but Reginald simply smiled and told him he would see him in court. Chloe collapsed onto the cold marble floor, her expensive designer dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. She sobbed uncontrollably, begging her high society friends to stay, but they completely ignored her pleas. They filed out of the luxurious ballroom in a hurried mass exodus, wanting absolutely nothing to do with a publicly humiliated fraud. Brad was in a total state of shock, clutching the binding contract that guaranteed the complete and utter destruction of his already failing startup. He looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, realizing that the foolish, senile old widow he had planned to exploit had completely outsmarted him and ruined his life. I looked down at the two of them, a pair of greedy, soulless predators who had tried to steal my wealth and destroy my son's gentle heart. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply picked up my elegant evening bag and adjusted my emerald green dress. I walked out of that extravagant, debt-filled venue with my head held high, leaving them surrounded by unpaid vendors and the crushing consequences of their own malicious greed. Outside in the cool evening air, Jamal was waiting for me by my car. He looked exhausted, but the heavy burden of Chloe's manipulation had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He pulled me into a tight, incredibly warm hug, burying his face in my shoulder, and simply said thank you. I hugged my beautiful boy back, resting my chin on his shoulder, knowing that my family, my wealth, and my legacy were finally safe. True love and loyalty cannot be bought, and those who try to steal it will always pay the highest price. 6 months have passed since that spectacular night. Jamal and I are doing wonderfully. The initial heartbreak was incredibly heavy for my beautiful boy, but the truth set him completely free. He has found a deep, lasting peace. He throws himself into his teaching with renewed passion, and he calls me every single day. Not out of obligation, but out of a profound respect for the wisdom and fierce love I showed him. Our bond is stronger than ever. As for me, I am finally enjoying the fruits of my lifelong labor, exactly on my own terms. Right now, I am sitting on the sun-drenched balcony of a private villa, overlooking the sparkling turquoise waters of the Amalfi Coast. I am sipping a delicious glass of wine that I bought with my own hard-earned money, perfectly surrounded by breathtaking beauty and experiencing an absolute, unshakable peace of mind. If this entire ordeal has taught me anything, it is a life lesson I will carry forever. True wealth cannot be bought, manipulated, or stolen. It is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect, honesty, and unwavering loyalty. Genuine love does not come with a luxury price tag, and it certainly never demands that you sacrifice your dignity. If you ever find yourself having to buy affection or fund an illusion to be treated like a human being, then that love was never real to begin with. Protect your heart. Protect your peace, and always protect your own worth. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments below exactly where you are watching from today and what time it is right there. See you in the next story. Have a very wonderful and blessed day.